Let me take you back to a time before the headlines, before the whispers, before the nightmare. This is the story of Isla Petrova, and you need to know who she was before everything went wrong. Picture this, a crisp autumn morning in the small town of Cedar Falls, Colorado. The air smells like pine and possibility. Inside Cedar Falls High, in a classroom decorated with maps and inspiring quotes, Isla is in her element. She's a history teacher, but she's so much more than that. She's the kind of teacher who makes the past feel alive. On this particular day, she's teaching about the Salem witch trials. And she tells her students, her voice firm and clear, remember this. The truth is the most important story we will ever tell. And a lie, spoken with enough conviction, can be more dangerous than any weapon. It's a lesson that would soon haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. After school, her world shifts from teacher to mom. The scene at her house is something out of a movie. Her husband, Ben, a carpenter with kind eyes and sawdust on his jeans, is flipping chocolate chip pancakes while their 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, giggles at the kitchen table, telling him about her day. The room is filled with this warm, buttery light and the sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. This was their sanctuary. This was their everything. And even at work, her heart was in the right place. She noticed a student, Lucas Miller, a smart kid, a star athlete, but looking troubled, his grades slipping. So she asked him to stay after class. Not as a punishment, but as a lifeline. "Everything okay, Lucas? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she said, her voice laced with nothing but concern. He shrugged it off, but thanked her for asking. She saw a student in need, and she reached out. It was who she was. It was a golden life, simple and good. But golden things, they can tarnish. And the first flicker of tarnish was just around the corner. That golden life I just described, it lasted about as long as a soap bubble. It was all about to pop. It happened on a Tuesday. Just an ordinary Tuesday. The final bell had rung, and Isla was wiping down the whiteboard, planning to pick up Chloe from ballet. Then, the intercom on her desk crackled. "Ms. Petrova, please report to the principal's office immediately." The "immediately" sent a little jolt through her. That's never a good word. She packed her bag, her mind racing. Was it about a budget cut for her debate club? Had something happened with a student? But the moment she stepped into the principal's office, she knew it was worse. So much worse. The air was ice cold. Principal Davies sat behind his desk, his face like stone. And sitting in the chair across from him was Lucas Miller. But this wasn't the troubled kid from after school. This Lucas had red-rimmed eyes, his shoulders were hunched, and he was staring at the floor as if he wanted to disappear. Principal Davies didn't offer her a seat. He just said, "Isla, Lucas has come to me with a very serious allegation." And then he said the words that would become a wrecking ball to her entire existence. He said that Lucas claimed she had coerced him, isolated him in the storage room by the gym, and the details don't matter. What matters is the effect. For Isla, the world didn't just tilt, it shattered. The room seemed to swim. She heard the principal's voice like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. Gross misconduct. She kept looking at Lucas, waiting for him to look up, to crack a smile, to say, "Just kidding, Ms. P." But he didn't. He just kept staring at that spot on the floor, the perfect picture of a victim. She finally found her voice, a choked whisper. "Lucas, why are you saying this? This isn't true. None of this is true." But the truth didn't seem to matter. She was told to leave the school premises immediately. Suspended. As she walked back to her classroom to get her things, it felt like a walk of shame. Students and teachers were gathered in the hallway, watching her through the classroom windows. Their faces were a gallery of horror, of judgment, of sheer curiosity. She was no longer Ms. Petrova, the beloved teacher. She was a spectacle. And then, as she sat in her car, hands shaking too badly to even put the key in the ignition, her phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. A news alert from the local station. The headline screamed up at her, popular Cedar Falls teacher under investigation for grooming student. The golden life was gone, replaced by a digital mob, knocking at her door. So there was Isla, trapped inside her own home. The four walls that used to be her sanctuary now felt like a prison. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. First, it was reporters, their voices slick with fake sympathy. Then, it was angry, anonymous callers. A woman's voice screeched, "You monster, stay away from our kids," before the line went dead. Isla finally just yanked the cord from the wall. The silence that followed was almost worse. Ben, God love him, he tried to be the rock. He held her, he told her they would fight this, that everyone who knew her would know this was a lie. But you could see the fear in his eyes. The confusion. He hired the best lawyer they could afford, a man named Arthur Finch. And sitting in Finch's overly air-conditioned office was the moment the nightmare got real, concrete details. Finch was a quiet man who had seen it all. He laid it out for them, piece by terrible piece, like a coroner conducting an autopsy on their life. "The case against you," he said, steepling his fingers, "is built on perception, not fact. And perception is a powerful thing." He showed them the evidence. The text messages. Isla had sent Lucas things like, "I'm worried about you, please see me after class," and "You're capable of great things, don't lose your way." At the time, they were lifelines to a struggling kid. Now, the prosecutor was calling them grooming tactics, a calculated pattern of isolation. Then there was the witness, another teacher who confirmed she'd seen Isla and Lucas in intense, private conversation. She wasn't lying. She was just describing the exact moments Isla was trying to help him. The truth was being twisted, weaponized. And the damage started to spread, like a stain they couldn't stop. Ben got a call. 3 clients canceled their big carpentry projects. "Sorry, Ben, just bad timing," they'd say. But he knew. It was the rumor. The stain had touched him, too. The worst moment, the one that truly broke Isla, came when she went to pick up Chloe from school. She waited in the car, trying to be discreet. She saw her little girl come out, holding a friend's hand. Then the friend's mother rushed over, snatched her child away, and shot Isla a look of pure poison. Chloe stood alone on the sidewalk, confused, looking for her mom. Isla watched her daughter's small, bewildered face and felt a piece of her soul crumble. That night, lying in bed in the crushing silence, she said the words to Ben that she knew had been true from the start. Her voice was a hollow whisper. "Nobody believes the truth anymore." And in that moment, holding her husband in the dark, she felt more alone than she ever thought possible. The unraveling was almost complete. The county courthouse was a fortress of cold, gray stone. For Isla, walking through those heavy doors felt like walking into her own tomb. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and floor polish. This was it. The place where her future would be decided. The first day of the trial. Isla sat beside Arthur Finch at the defense table, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She wore a simple, plain dress. Ben sat right behind her, his presence a warm anchor in the freezing room. But then, the jury filed in. 12 strangers. Isla tried to make eye contact, to silently plead her case with a look, but their faces were blank, unreadable stone. They had already seen the news. They thought they knew her. Then, the prosecutor stood up. Mr. Henderson. He was a handsome man with a voice that could charm a snake. He walked right up to the jury box, like an old friend sharing a secret. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "You are about to meet a woman the community of Cedar Falls thought they knew. A dedicated teacher. A caring mentor." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Then his voice hardened. "But that woman is a carefully constructed illusion. A predator who used her position of trust to prey upon a vulnerable young man." Isla felt each word like a physical blow. He painted a picture of her not as a teacher, but as a master manipulator. He took every kind thing she'd ever done for Lucas and twisted it, making her compassion seem calculated, her concern seem like a trap. By the time he finished his opening statement, Isla could feel the jury's eyes on her, and they weren't just curious anymore. They were suspicious. Then, they called Lucas to the stand. He walked in, looking younger and more fragile than ever. He wouldn't look at Isla. Not once. When he spoke about the alleged incident, his voice trembled. He stuttered. He wiped away a single, perfect tear. It was a performance worthy of an award. He described the fear, the confusion, the shame. He talked about how he looked up to her, and how she betrayed that trust. The jury hung on his every word. You could see it in their faces, the sympathy, the anger on his behalf. Arthur Finch did his best during cross-examination. Lucas, isn't it true that Ms. Petrova gave you a failing grade for cheating just a week before this alleged event? Lucas just looked down, his voice a meek whisper. I don't remember the timing, sir. He was lying, and he was good at it. Every question Finch asked, Lucas had an answer for, always framed to make himself look like the victim. The harder Finch pushed, the more sympathetic Lucas became. It was a losing battle. The final blow of the day came from the credible witness, the other teacher who saw them talking. She described seeing Isla and Lucas in what she called intense, private conversation. She wasn't lying. She was just describing the moments Isla was trying to help a student in crisis. But in this courtroom, through this new poisoned lens, that simple act of kindness sounded secretive, inappropriate, guilty. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, Isla felt the weight of it all crushing her. The truth wasn't just losing. It was being erased, replaced by a lie that was somehow more powerful, more believable. She stood up, her legs weak, and felt Ben's hand on her shoulder. But as they walked out, all she could see were the 12 pairs of juror eyes, following her, and in them, she saw a verdict already being written. Now it was their turn. Arthur Finch stood up to present the defense, and you could feel the weight in the room. It was like watching a man try to hold back a tidal wave with a broom. The problem wasn't that he had nothing to say. The problem was that the prosecution's story was just slicker, more dramatic. A tale of a predatory teacher and an innocent boy was a simple, horrible story that people knew how to feel about. The truth, that it was all a twisted lie over a bad grade, was complicated. And in a courtroom, complicated often loses. Finch started by calling character witnesses. Isla's friend, Sarah, testified about what a wonderful, caring person she was. A former student, now in college, talked about how Ms. Petrova was the reason he graduated. They were sincere, they were heartfelt. But under the prosecutor's cross-examination, it all sounded weak. Henderson would just smile politely and ask, "And were you present in the storage room on the day in question?" When they said no, he'd just nod, as if to say, "So you don't really know, do you?" He made their love for Isla seem like blindness. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Arthur Finch looked at Isla and gave a small, grim nod. It was time. The defense calls Isla Petrova to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. This was it. Her one chance to look the jury in the eye and tell her story. She walked to the stand, her knees feeling like water. She promised to tell the truth, and then she did. She spoke calmly, clearly. She talked about her love for teaching. She explained every single text message, showing the context of a teacher trying to reach a student who was slipping away. She described Lucas not as a villain, but as a kid she was worried about. She was believable. She was Isla. For a brief, shining moment, you could see a flicker of doubt on a few jurors' faces. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the monster they'd been told about. But then, Prosecutor Henderson stood up for his cross-examination. He started slow, circling her like a shark. His questions were no longer smooth. They were sharp, rapid-fire, designed to confuse and corner her. "Ms. Petrova, you admit you were alone with him on multiple occasions? You admit you texted him from your personal phone? Isn't it true that your concern was excessive?" He took every single one of her virtues, her compassion, her dedication, her willingness to go the extra mile, and he presented them to the jury as vices. Her caring nature became an unhealthy fixation. Her private talks became secret meetings. He made her normal, human behavior sound like a calculated, step-by-step grooming manual. Isla tried to keep her composure, but you could see her cracking. Her answers became shorter, more defensive. Her voice started to waver. The calm, collected teacher for moments before was being stripped away, replaced by a frustrated, frightened woman. And that's exactly what Henderson wanted. He needed the jury to see her composure break. He needed her to look guilty. Finally, he landed the blow he'd been setting up. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Ms. Petrova," he said, "isn't the real story here that Lucas Miller caught you cheating on your husband with another teacher, and you fabricated this entire accusation against him to discredit him and keep him quiet?" The lie was so audacious, so vile, that it stole the air from the room. Isla gasped. "That's not true," she cried out, her voice raw with emotion. "How can you? Why would you even?" But she was sputtering. She was emotional. And to the jury, in that moment, she didn't look like an innocent woman wrongly accused. She looked like someone who had just been caught. Arthur Finch objected, the judge sustained it, but the damage was done. The seed was planted. As Isla stepped down from the stand, trembling, she knew. She had walked up there with the truth, and she was walking away looking like a liar. The dilemma was no longer a legal one. It was a human one. How do you prove you're a good person, when everyone has already decided you're not? The end had arrived. After days of testimony, the trial was barreling toward its conclusion. The air in the courtroom was so thick with tension you could barely breathe. Isla felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the entire world was waiting to see if she would fall. First, it was Prosecutor Henderson's turn for his closing argument. And he delivered a masterpiece. He paced slowly in front of the jury box, his voice a controlled, powerful instrument of persuasion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began almost gently, "you have seen a performance. A carefully crafted performance of the caring teacher." He turned and pointed directly at Isla. "But performances end. And the truth remains. The truth is in the text messages that crossed the line. The truth is in the private, secret meetings. The truth is in the tearful, credible testimony of a young man whose life was upended by a betrayal of trust." He walked them back through every piece of evidence, painting each one in the darkest possible color. He called Lucas a brave young man, and Isla a wolf in sheep's clothing. He ended with a powerful, chilling statement. This isn't just about guilt or innocence. This is about safety. It's about making sure that when parents send their children to school, they are safe from the very people hired to protect them. Do your duty. Find the defendant guilty. He sat down, and you could feel it. The jury was with him. You could see it in their set jaws, their firm nods. They were ready to convict. Then Arthur Finch stood up. He looked tired. He knew he was fighting a ghost, a story, not facts. His closing argument was passionate, a plea for reason over emotion. "The prosecution has given you a great story," he said, his voice rough. "But it is a story built on sand. There is no physical evidence. There are no witnesses to the alleged event. There is only the word of one person against another. And we have shown you a powerful motive for that person to lie." He reminded them of the failed grade, the threatened scholarship. Isla Petrova is not a monster. She is a dedicated teacher who did her job, and for that, she is being crucified. You cannot convict a woman on a story alone. You must have proof. And there is none. It was a good argument, a logical argument. But as he spoke, the jury's faces remained stony. Logic was losing to the powerful, emotional narrative Henderson had woven. Finch finished, his shoulders slumping slightly. He had given it his all, and it hadn't been enough. The judge was about to give the jury their final instructions. It was over. Isla looked at the 12 people who held her life in their hands and saw nothing but closed doors. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering flame inside her was about to be snuffed out forever. And in that moment, something in her broke. It wasn't a calculated decision. It was a raw, human reaction. As the judge opened his mouth, Isla stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Please. May I say one thing? Just one thing to them." The courtroom gasped. Her own attorney looked at her, horrified. This wasn't procedure. This was a Hail Mary pass from the deepest depths of despair. Prosecutor Henderson shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly improper." The judge stared at Isla, his expression unreadable. For a long, agonizing moment, he considered it. Then, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Make it quick, Ms. Petrova." Isla stepped out from behind the defense table. She walked slowly until she was standing directly in front of the jury box. She wasn't a lawyer making a case. She was just a person, stripped bare. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice, though thick with emotion, was steady. "I am not a performer," she began, looking at each of them. "I am a teacher. I am a wife. I am a mother." She swallowed hard. "Everything I have, my family, my home, my name, it's all right here in your hands. I have told you the truth. The simple, boring truth. I did nothing more than try to help a student, and for that, I have lost everything." A tear finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "My daughter asks me if the bad people are gone. And I have to look at her and tell her I don't know." Her voice broke into a sob. "Please. I am begging you. Don't take me away from her. Don't make me a criminal for caring. I am innocent. I am so innocent." She stood there, weeping quietly, her hands clasped as if in prayer. There was no sound in the courtroom. No one moved. For a breathtaking moment, the legal machinery had ground to a halt, and all that was left was one woman's shattered heart, offered up as her final piece of evidence. It was the most powerful moment of the entire trial. And it was about to be completely obliterated by what happened next. For a long, terrible moment after Isla finished speaking, nobody moved. The only sound in the courtroom was her ragged breathing, the echo of her sobs hanging in the air. She had laid her soul bare. She had nothing left. She stood there, exposed and broken, waiting for a sign, any sign, from the stone-faced jurors. And then, the spell shattered. Prosecutor Henderson shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "Your Honor, I must object. This is a blatant attempt to manipulate the jury with theatrics. This has no place in a court of law. I move that the jury be instructed to disregard this performance." The judge, his own stern composure ruffled, nodded grimly. He looked down at Isla, not unkindly, but with finality. "Ms. Petrova, while the court appreciates your emotion, Mr. Henderson is correct. Procedure exists for a reason. The time for testimony is over." He turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, you will disregard the defendants unsolicited." "Your Honor." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. All heads turned. Arthur Finch was standing. But he wasn't looking at the judge, or the jury, or even at Isla. He was looking down at a simple, slim, silver disc case on the table in front of him. It was unmarked. Anonymous. "If it pleases the court," Finch said, his voice deceptively calm, "there will be no need for the jury to disregard anything, because the defense has one final piece of evidence to enter into the record." Henderson looked like he'd been slapped. "What? This is absurd. The defense has rested. What is this, some kind of desperate trick?" Finch picked up the disc. "This evidence was delivered to my office under unusual circumstances. It arrived anonymously, just yesterday. Given its potentially explosive nature and the need to verify its authenticity, I chose to withhold it until this moment." The judge leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. "And what, Mr. Finch, is on this mysterious disc?" "That, Your Honor," Finch said, a sliver of steel entering his voice for the first time, "is a digital video file. It purports to show the events inside the school storage room on the day and time in question. From a vantage point the school security system did not cover." The courtroom erupted. A video. A video. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The jurors stared, their earlier stoicism replaced by wide-eyed shock. Isla just stood frozen, her mind reeling. A video? Of the storage room? How? What did it show? Henderson was sputtering. This is outrageous. This is a violation of every discovery rule. We've had no time to authenticate this, to examine it. This could be a fabrication, a deepfake. You can't just spring this. The prosecution's concerns about authenticity are noted, the judge interrupted, his gaze fixed on the disc. But if this is indeed a recording of the alleged event, it goes to the very heart of this case. Mr. Finch, why should I allow this? Finch held up the disc. Because, Your Honor, the note that came with it said only one thing. He paused, letting the silence build. It said, "The truth has a way of surfacing." Given the stakes, I believe this court has an obligation to see if that is true. The judge was silent for a long, tense moment, weighing the chaos against the pursuit of truth. He looked at Isla's tear-streaked face. He looked at the jury's confusion. He looked at the unmarked, silver disc. "Bailiff," the judge said finally, his decision made. "Please enter that disc into evidence as Defense Exhibit D. And then, let's see what it has to show us." The bailiff stepped forward, took the disc from Finch's hand, and carried it over to the AV system. The click of the tray sliding into the machine was the loudest sound Isla had ever heard. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. In the hushed silence, Isla, the jury, the entire courtroom, could only watch and wait. The performance was over. The truth, whatever it was about to speak for itself. The click of the DVD player was followed by the low hum of the projector warming up. Every single person in that courtroom, the judge, the jury, the reporters, Isla, Ben, even the stoic bailiff, stared at the large screen on the wall. It was a black rectangle, a void about to be filled with, what? The ultimate proof of guilt? Or something else entirely? The first thing that appeared was not an image, but a timestamp, glowing white in the corner of the screen. It matched the exact date and time of the alleged incident. Then, the video resolved. The footage was shaky, slightly grainy, clearly shot on a phone that had been hastily placed on a high shelf. The angle was looking down into the school storage room. You could see stacked chairs, old sports equipment, and a dusty window letting in a sliver of afternoon light. The perspective was all wrong for a security camera. This was hidden. This was secret. For a few seconds, the room was empty. The only sound was the faint, tinny audio of the phone's microphone picking up the distant slam of a locker and a muffled shout from the gym. Then, the door opened. It wasn't Isla who walked in. It was Lucas Miller. And he was alone. The boy who had just days ago sat on the witness stand, a picture of fragile trauma, was gone. This Lucas moved with a lazy, confident swagger. He had his phone in his hand, and he was smiling. No, he was smirking. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning, calculating. This wasn't a victim entering a scene of trauma. This was a stage manager arriving before the show. He walked over to a clear spot on the floor, near a rolled-up wrestling mat. And then he started rehearsing. He practiced a look of fear, widening his eyes and shrinking back. He practiced a stance, pulling his shoulders in to make himself look smaller. He even mouthed a few silent words, like an actor running his lines. The courtroom was dead silent, but you could feel the confusion beginning to ripple through the room. What were they watching? Then, the door opened again. Isla walked in. The Isla on the screen looked exactly as she had testified, concerned, a little tired, her teacher's lanyard hanging around her neck. She saw Lucas, and her first words, clear as day through the microphone, were, "Lucas? Are you okay? You wanted to see me." Lucas's entire demeanor transformed in a heartbeat. The confidence melted away. The smirk vanished. In its place was the slumped, vulnerable boy from the trial. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and trembling. I don't know, Ms. Petrova. I just needed to talk. Somewhere private." The Isla in the courtroom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She was watching her own nightmare, but from an angle she never knew existed. On screen, she took a step closer, her face the picture of professional concern. "Of course, Lucas. You know I'm here to help. Is it about your grade? Because we can." And then it happened. The moment that would define everything. Lucas, in a movement so fast it was a blur, reached out and grabbed Isla's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. At the same time, he used his other hand to grab her forearm. It was a bizarre, unnatural grapple. Isla on screen flinched, startled. "Lucas, what are you?" But Lucas was already moving, manipulating their limbs. He positioned her hand on his own arm, creating the perfect, damning tableau. To anyone walking in, it would look like she was grabbing him. He was physically constructing the lie, right there, with his own hands. He was the sculptor, and the accusation was his clay. Then, a third voice, young and male, whispered from off-camera, from the direction of the hidden phone. "Got it." Lucas immediately let go, stepping back with that same practiced, frightened look on his face. The entire interaction had lasted less than 10 seconds. The Isla on the screen stood there, utterly bewildered, rubbing her wrist. "Lucas, what was that? What is going on?" But Lucas wasn't looking at her. He was looking toward the hidden phone, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. And then he spoke, his voice dropping its tremble, becoming cold and clear. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, each one a nail in the coffin of his own credibility. "Perfect. She played her part just like I thought she would. My dad will make sure they believe me. They always do." On the screen, Isla, looking completely lost, shook her head and walked out of the room, the door swinging shut behind her. The video didn't end there. For a few more seconds, Lucas stood in the center of the room, looking right at the hidden camera. He gave a little shrug, a casual, chilling gesture. Then he said to his unseen friend, "Let's get out of this dump. I've got what I need." The screen went black. The truth hadn't just surfaced. It had detonated. The silence in the courtroom was no longer tense. It was profound. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. The jury wasn't looking at stone-faced Isla anymore. They were staring, mouths agape, at Lucas Miller, who had shrunk down in his seat, trying to become invisible. The video was over. But the real drama was just beginning. For a full 10 seconds after the screen went black, nobody in that courtroom moved. It was as if the video had frozen them all in place. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, sucking all the sound and the air and the certainty out of the room. And then, the dam broke. It started with a sharp, guttural sound. A sob? No. It was a cry of pure, raw rage. It came from Ben, Isla's husband. He shot up from his seat, his face a thundercloud, his finger pointing like a spear across the room at Lucas Miller. "You!" was all he could roar. "You lying little." The judge, jolted back to reality, slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court." But the chaos was already unleashed. Reporters were shouting, the audience was buzzing like a kicked hive, and the bailiff moved to stand between Ben and the rest of the room. Through it all, Isla just sat there, trembling, her hands over her face. She wasn't crying tears of sadness now. They were tears of vindication, of fury, of a year of her life stolen. But Arthur Finch wasn't done. The video had paused, but he walked back to the center of the room, a predator who had just cornered his prey. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "The video has not concluded. There is more." The judge, looking pale and utterly stunned, just nodded. "Proceed." The screen flickered back to life. The scene was the same storage room, but now it was just Lucas and his unseen accomplice. Lucas was pacing, a bundle of nervous energy. The off-camera voice, the friend, spoke again, his voice laced with a fear that Lucas clearly didn't share. "Dude, are you sure about this? This is really serious. We could get in so much trouble." Lucas stopped pacing and laughed. A cold, dismissive laugh that made the jury flinch. "Relax. It's our word against hers. Who are they gonna believe? The star quarterback with a full-ride scholarship on the line, or the teacher who failed me? There it was. The motive, laid out in his own arrogant, casual words. Not a story of trauma, but of revenge. A spoiled, entitled revenge for a failed grade. The friend's voice was still worried. But what about the cameras? The system in this hall has been broken for months, Lucas said, tapping his temple. I checked. My dad plays golf with the school board president. I know things. There's no evidence. None. He walked back into the frame, looking directly at the hidden phone, his face hardening. She thought she could fail me? She thought she could mess with my future? I'll show her what messing with a future looks like. By the time my dad's lawyers are done with her, she'll wish she'd never even learned my name. Then, the final piece of the conspiracy snapped into place. The friend, his voice trembling, asked the question everyone in the courtroom was thinking. And what about the story? What exactly are we saying she did? Lucas shrugged, as if they were discussing what to have for lunch. Doesn't really matter, does it? Something gross. Something people will hate. She touched my arm, she looked at me wrong. They'll fill in the blanks themselves. People are stupid. They love a good witch hunt. On those words, they'll fill in the blanks themselves. The video ended for good. The screen went permanently black. The silence that returned was different this time. It was heavy. It was sickened. It was the sound of 12 jurors realizing they had almost been made accomplices to a monstrous lie. All eyes turned to Lucas Miller. The carefully constructed persona of the victim had vaporized. He was slouched so low in his chair he was almost underneath it. His face was chalk-white, sweaty. He looked like what he was, a petulant, cruel boy who had been caught. Prosecutor Henderson didn't even look at his star witness. He was staring at his notes, his face ashen, his entire case, his entire worldview, lying in ashes around him. He had been Lucas's most powerful, unwitting weapon. The judge didn't need to hear any more. He looked at the jury, his own expression a mixture of fury and profound apology. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I believe we have seen and heard all we need to. The court is ready for your verdict." But there would be no long deliberation. There was no need. The conspiracy wasn't just revealed. It had been recorded, in high definition, by its own architect. The lie was dead. But the wreckage it left behind was only just beginning to smolder. The silence after the video ended was the loudest sound Isla had ever heard. It wasn't just quiet. It was a physical pressure in the room, thick with shame, with anger, with the sheer weight of a terrible, terrible mistake about to be corrected. Every single person in that room was trapped in their own private reckoning. The jurors weren't just shocked anymore. They were angry. You could see it in the tight lines around their mouths, in the way one woman clenched her fist on the railing, in the way another stared at Lucas with pure, unvarnished disgust. They had been played. They had been used as weapons in a cruel boy's revenge fantasy, and the humiliation of that was burning in their eyes. Prosecutor Henderson didn't move. He just sat at his table, staring at the blank screen as if it had just pronounced his own professional death sentence. All his smooth confidence, his clever arguments, his powerful closing, it had all just evaporated, revealed as a castle built on a lie. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a car crash in slow motion, and realized he was the one driving. And Lucas Miller, he had completely come apart. The arrogant, smirking boy from the video was gone, replaced by a terrified child. He was crying now, for real, his shoulders shaking with ragged, ugly sobs. But these weren't the practiced, perfect tears from the witness stand. These were the tears of someone who had just been caught and who knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no escape. The judge, a man who had presided over this case with stoic impartiality, finally broke the silence. He slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, but it vibrated with a controlled fury. "Mr. Henderson," the judge said, not even looking at him, "does the prosecution have any further evidence to present?" Henderson stood up, his movements robotic. "No, Your Honor," he whispered, the words barely audible. The judge then turned to the jury box. His gaze was heavy, apologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have presided over this court for 22 years. I have never, in all my years, seen a more blatant, a more calculated perversion of justice than what we have all just witnessed." He took a deep breath. The law has procedures. It has rules. But sometimes the truth is so overwhelming, so clear, that the law must step aside and simply let it speak. Therefore, I am taking the extraordinary step of directing a verdict in this case. He turned and looked directly at Isla. His stern expression softened, just for a moment. "Isla Petrova, please stand." Isla's legs were weak. Ben was there, his arm around her, holding her up. She rose, her body trembling. "On the sole count of gross misconduct and coercion," the judge's voice boomed, clear and final, "this court finds you not guilty." The words didn't feel real. They were an abstract concept, a legal phrase. But then, the dam broke behind her. Ben let out a choked cry and pulled her into a crushing hug. Her friend Sarah, in the audience, burst into tears of relief. The sound was like a trigger being pulled. The judge wasn't finished. He turned his gaze, now as cold as ice, toward Lucas. "As for you, young man," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "bailiff, take him into custody. You are being charged with perjury, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to commit defamation. Your day of reckoning is just beginning." The bailiff moved swiftly, clicking handcuffs around Lucas's wrists. The boy didn't resist. He just kept sobbing, his head bowed, as he was led away from his horrified parents, who looked on in stunned silence. Isla watched him go, but she felt no triumph, no joy, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The nightmare was over, technically. The truth had won. But as she stood there in her husband's arms, in a courtroom that had been utterly transformed from a place of condemnation to one of liberation, she knew one thing for certain. The woman who had walked into this room, a condemned criminal, was gone. And she had no idea who would be walking out. The gavel had fallen. The words, "not guilty," had been spoken. But there was no celebration. There was only exhaustion. The courtroom, which had been a pressure cooker of emotion, suddenly deflated. The buzz of the crowd faded to a murmur as people filed out, shaking their heads, speaking in hushed, shocked tones. For Isla, the world had become a blur. Ben's arm was around her, guiding her, as if she were a patient who had just survived a major surgery. Arthur Finch was packing his briefcase, a look of grim satisfaction on his face, but even he was quiet. He had won, but the victory felt dirty. As they moved toward the doors, Isla saw Prosecutor Henderson gathering his papers. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The arrogance, the certainty, was gone from his face. In its place was something worse, a kind of embarrassed pity. He gave her a small, stiff nod. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgment. A recognition that his entire case had been a house of cards built on a lie, and he had been the one pounding the nails. Isla looked away. She had no room left in her heart for his regret. Then they stepped outside. The sunlight was blinding. After the artificial light of the courtroom, it felt harsh and unwelcoming. And there, waiting for them, was a scrum of reporters. Microphones were thrust toward her face like weapons. Camera flashes popped, making her flinch. "Ms. Petrova, how does it feel to be vindicated? Do you have anything to say to Lucas Miller? Will you be suing the school district?" The questions came in a frantic, overlapping wave. They wanted a soundbite. They wanted the triumphant tears of a wronged woman finally getting justice. But Isla had no tears left. She had no words. She just stared straight ahead, her face a blank mask, letting Ben shoulder through the crowd, his voice a low, protective growl. "No comment. Please, let us through." They finally reached their car, a safe, metal cocoon. Ben slammed the door, shutting out the noise. For a long minute, They just sat there in the sudden, ringing silence. The engine turned over. They pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse, the cameras, and the nightmare of the trial behind. But as they drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, heading home, Isla realized the most terrifying thing of all. The nightmare wasn't behind her. It was inside the car with them. It was in the way she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. It was in the hollow, scooped-out feeling in her chest. Ben reached over and took her hand. "It's over, Isla," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're free. We're free." Isla looked out the window at the town that had so quickly turned against her. She saw the houses, the trees, the people going about their normal lives. It all looked the same, but it wasn't. It was all tainted. She squeezed his hand, but didn't answer. Because she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was wrong. It wasn't over. The trial was over. The legal battle was won. But for her, the aftermath was just beginning. And she had no idea how you ever come back from being erased. Going home felt less like a victory parade and more like returning to the scene of a crime. Their house, which should have been a fortress, felt violated. A few "Welcome home, Isla" balloons were tied to the porch rail, bobbing in the breeze. They were well-meaning, from a handful of brave friends, but they looked sad and out of place, like decorations after a party everyone left early. Inside, the silence was deafening. It was the same silence that had filled the house during the worst of the trial, but now it had a different quality. It wasn't a waiting silence, heavy with dread. It was an empty silence. The fight was over, and all that was left was the echo. Isla walked from room to room, running her hand over the furniture. It was all exactly where it should be, but it felt like a museum exhibit of her former life. Her daughter, Chloe, clung to her leg, then looked up with those big, serious eyes. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice small. "Are the bad people gone for real now?" The question was like a knife to Isla's heart. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the bad people weren't monsters under the bed? They were whispers in the grocery store, judgment in the eyes of neighbors, a lie so convincing it could almost rewrite reality. "Yes, honey," Isla managed to say, her voice cracking. "They're gone." But the words felt like just another lie she had to tell to keep the world safe for her child. A few days later, the principal called. He offered her job back, his voice dripping with a thick, awkward apology. "The district fully supports your reinstatement, Isla. We're so terribly sorry for what you've been through." She stood in her empty kitchen, listening to him, and her eyes traveled down the hall to the home office where she used to grade papers with such passion. The thought of walking back into that school, of standing in front of a classroom, of seeing the ghost of Lucas Miller in every hallway. It made her stomach clench. She thanked him and hung up. The next day, she made herself go there. She parked in the lot and walked into Cedar Falls High after hours, when it was empty. She stood in the doorway of her old classroom. The desks were the same. The posters were the same. But it was different. This wasn't her sanctuary anymore. It was the place where the first accusation was spoken. The walls themselves felt like they were accusing her. She looked at her desk, and all she could see was the chair she sat in the day she was suspended. She couldn't breathe. She backed out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't do it. She couldn't just pick up the pieces and glue them back together into the same old vase. The vase was shattered, and everyone who looked at it would always see the cracks. You might think the story ends with the not guilty verdict. That justice was served, and everyone moved on. But real life doesn't work like that. The real punishment wasn't handed down by a judge in a courtroom. It was delivered by the town of Cedar Falls itself. Lucas Miller wasn't sent to prison. He was a juvenile, and his family had expensive lawyers. He got probation, community service, and a permanent juvenile record that would follow him like a shadow. But that was the least of his problems. The Millers became the most hated family in town. The story of the video, of the elaborate, malicious lie, spread like wildfire. The "for sale" sign went up on their perfectly manicured lawn within a month. Rumor had it they moved in the middle of the night, to some other state where no one had heard of Cedar Falls or the teacher their son had tried to destroy. A few weeks after they left, a letter arrived for Isla. It wasn't from Lucas. It was from his mother. Isla's hands trembled as she opened it, half expecting, maybe even hoping for, the apology she so desperately deserved. But it wasn't an apology. Not really. The letter was filled with words like teenage stupidity and a prank that went too far. It talked about how Lucas was a good boy at heart and how his future was forever tarnished. It asked for Isla's understanding. It was a masterpiece of deflection. It was a parent refusing to see the monster they had raised, blaming the world for not tolerating his cruelty. Isla read it once. Then, without a word, she walked to the kitchen trash can. She didn't crumple it. She didn't rip it up in a rage. She simply opened her hand and let it fall. It landed on a coffee ground and a banana peel. That small, quiet act was more powerful than any scream. There was no understanding left in her. No forgiveness. The letter, like the family who sent it, was just garbage. Ben found her staring out the kitchen window. "What was that?" he asked. "Nothing," Isla said, her voice flat. It was nothing. And it was. The Millers were gone. The town had punished them more effectively than any court ever could. But as Isla watched a lone bird fly across the gray sky, she felt nothing. No satisfaction. No closure. Just the cold, hard truth that some things, once broken, can never be put back together. Not for her, and not for the boy who broke them. The real punishment for the crime was a life sentence for everyone involved. A year passed. The sharp edges of the nightmare began to dull, sanded down by time and the simple, daily acts of life. Isla, Ben, and Chloe were packing. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the living room, their open mouths filled with the memories of a life they were choosing to leave behind. They were moving to a new city, a place where no one knew their name or their story. As Isla taped a box of books shut, her laptop chimed from the kitchen table. It was the sound for a new email. She almost ignored it. But something made her look. The sender's address was a jumble of letters and numbers. The subject line was simple: "I'm the one who sent the video." Her breath caught in her throat. For a year, this had been the one loose thread, the one question that still haunted the edges of her mind. Who had been there? Who had held onto the truth and, in the final desperate moment, thrown her a lifeline? With trembling hands, she opened it. "Dear Ms. Petrova, you don't know me, but my name is David. I was Lucas's friend. I was the one holding the phone in the storage room." Isla sat down, her legs suddenly weak. She kept reading. "I have played that day over in my head 1,000 times. I want you to know that I was scared. Lucas was powerful. His family was powerful. I was just a kid from the wrong side of town on a scholarship, and I was terrified that if I crossed him, I'd lose everything. So I went along with it. I filmed it. And I have lived with the shame every single day since." The email described the weight of the secret. How he'd kept the video, not out of some noble plan, but as a kind of insurance policy against Lucas. How he'd watched the town turn against her. How he'd seen the news coverage of the trial, each day making him feel sicker. "The day you spoke to the jury," he wrote, "I was watching the news with my mom. They showed you crying. You said, 'I am so innocent.' And my mom, who didn't know anything about the video, she just shook her head and said, 'That poor woman. My God, she's telling the truth.' And I knew I couldn't hide anymore. You were the only teacher who ever saw me. Not the scholarship kid, not Lucas's sidekick. Just me. You told me once I could be a good writer. You were the only one who ever believed I could be good at anything. So I made a copy of the video. I put it on a disc. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if it would even be allowed. I just knew I had to try. I had to be good, for once. I am so sorry it took me so long." Isla read the words again and again. I had to be good, for once. This boy, this scared kid, had been her anonymous savior. Not a lawyer, not a detective. A guilty, frightened teenager who finally found his courage. She didn't feel anger toward him. She felt a profound, aching sadness for him. He had been a prisoner of the lie, too. She wrote back. Just a few lines. David, thank you for your courage. You didn't just send a video. You gave me my life back. And you were right. You are good. Isla. She hit send. And for the first time since the whole nightmare began, since the moment she was called into the principal's office, Isla put her head down on the kitchen table and cried. But these weren't tears of pain, or fear, or even relief. They were tears of release. The last knot of bitterness and confusion inside her finally loosened. The circle was closed. The truth had not only surfaced. It had been delivered by the most unlikely messenger of all, a boy finally choosing to be good, proving that her faith in her students had never been misplaced. It was the final piece she needed to finally, truly, begin to heal. The moving truck pulled away from the house on Hemlock Street for the last time. Isla didn't look back. She got into the car with Ben and Chloe, and as they drove, she watched their old life in the rearview mirror, watching it get smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared. They drove for hours, toward a new city, a new home where the walls didn't hold whispers and the streets weren't paved with judgment. Chloe sang along to kids' songs in the back seat, and Ben reached over, his hand finding Isla's. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The simple, steady pressure said it all. We're together. We're moving forward. Isla didn't go back to a classroom. How could she? That part of her was still too tender. But she found a new purpose, one forged in the fire of what she'd survived. She started a small non-profit from her new home office, called the True Story Project. She used her experience to help others who had been wrongly accused, guiding them through the legal and emotional nightmare she knew all too well. One afternoon, she was on a video call with a man whose story mirrored her own. She listened, she advised, and when he asked how she kept going, she found herself saying the words that had once been her classroom mantra, but now came from a much deeper place. The truth is the most important story we will ever tell, she said, her voice steady and sure. And we must never stop fighting for it. She ended the call and looked out her new window. Below, in a park across the street, she saw Chloe laughing on a swing, pushed by Ben. The sound of her daughter's joy, unburdened and free, drifted up through the glass. It wasn't a happy ending. Those are for storybooks. This was something better. This was a new chapter. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Isla was eager to turn the page. This story is a chilling reminder that perception is not always reality. If Isla's fight for the truth left you thinking, subscribe for more. Next week, we're telling the story of a 911 call that revealed a secret no one was supposed to hear.